Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mahima Nayyar, faculty in the International Family Studies program in Tata Institute of Social Sciences. We are working on the course Gender and Social Work, and the module that I will be covering today is Violence Against Women. Now, within violence against women is a very huge topic. So remember, this lecture is an overview. You have to do many more readings for this. But today what I'm going to basically look at is define violence a little bit, look at the situation of women in the country in terms of violence, look at different models of violence. So what we're going to do is introduce the topic, look at the learning outcomes, the situation of violence against women, theoretical models of gender-based violence, within which I'll cover sociological theories, social psychological theories, psychological theories and ecological framework related to violence. Then we'll look at impact of violence against women and how do we work with survivors. Now, there are, according to the National Crime Records Bureau, there are 3,27,394 cases of crime against women in the year of 2015. Delhi recorded the highest rate of crime against women overall. With 17,104 cases, the capital recorded a crime rate of 184.3 per 1 lakh female population. Now, the different kinds of crime against women included dowry deaths, honor killings, witchcraft-related murders, female feticide and infanticide, rape, domestic violence, abduction, acid throwing, and so on. Now, the crime rates give an indication of the level of violence faced by women. Violence against women is a much broader concept. So even if there is no crime that is committed against a woman, she may still be facing violence. We'll look at that when we go further. What does that mean? Now, the elimination of all forms of violence against women adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1993 defined violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women. This includes threats of acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. So the important components here are that it's not just physical, which is how it's usually defined, and it's not just in public spaces, it's also there in private spaces. Now, earlier violence was seen as abnormal and growing out of social or personal pathology. After 1970, the perspective towards violence changed. It was believed that the family violence, which is physical violence against family members, is a normal part of family life in most societies. So, from the view that it only is pathological or it happens very rarely, there was an understanding which developed that it's actually very common and it's happening much more frequently than we imagined. Now, the term normal, according to Gels and Strauss, has had at least 3 meanings: that it's statistically frequent, it's culturally approved, and it's approved by the user of the adjective. Why this is important is because that means many numbers of people are affected by this phenomenon and many numbers of people are supporting this phenomenon, and it's also approved. Now, violence arises because of unequal power relationships in society, and it serves to maintain those unequal power relationships. So, violence is not without purpose. Violence always has a certain kind of purpose. In India, violence against women came into public discourse during the 1970s with frequent reports of bride burnings happening in alleged domestic accidents. So, there was not much of a feminist movement at that point of time, but gradually people working in the area started realizing that many women were dying with regard to these accidental deaths, that they were dying within the household when they were cooking and they were doing. With the increasing numbers which were coming into, people started exploring what was actually happening. Why were so many women dying like that? The women's movement then became stronger and examined these so-called accidental deaths, and the phenomenon of dowry deaths entered public discourse. So before that, all these deaths were going under the carpet and there was no acknowledgement of the violence that existed within the domestic sphere. This resulted in a concerted campaign to address issues of familial violence against women, And the Dowry Prohibition Act in 1961 outlawed dowry, but this practice has continued in various forms. Now, based on this introduction, what we are going to learn today from this module is describing the nature of violence against women, explaining different theories of gender-based violence, based on these theories, analyzing the reasons for the violence and identifying interventions in the areas of violence against women. Now, first we look at the situation of violence against women in India. The results suggest that 43.5% of women reported at least one psychologically abusive behavior and 40.3% reported experiencing at least one form of violent physical behavior. This study has been done by Inclin in 2000. The National Family Health Survey, the third one in between 2005 and 6, found that 30.4% of married women in India aged between 15 to 49 years have experienced physical, sexual or emotional domestic violence. It's important to understand that the threats, the curtailment of liberty is also a part of domestic violence. 1 in 10 has experienced sexual violence, 7% of them have suffered severe injuries. The NFH's findings also brought out the extent of internalization of gender-based socialization. So 41% of the women agreed that a beating was justified if the wife shows disrespect for her in-laws. Secondly, 35% of women agreed with the reasoning of having neglecting the house or children, and therefore beatings or violence against her were justified. Other significantly accepted circumstances included the wife arguing with husband, failing to cook properly. Over half of all women surveyed justified domestic abuse for at least one of the reasons. Now, it's important to understand what's happening here. When violence, when people who are getting beaten up also justify that violence, then it tends to be all pervasive. And there is a culture of violence that prevails where it allows certain people to have the power to beat up certain people. So, suppose the man is not doing the certain thing in the house, would women be given the same authority to say that, okay, it's all right for the woman to beat up her husband because she is not doing certain things? Or are we the kind of a society who's going to allow violence in any form? So that is the question that comes about. Now, in a study by Special Cell for Women and Children, it was found that most women sought external help only after undergoing many years of violence or when they were faced with situations that threatened their immediate survival, such as loss of shelter, income, threat to life of self or children, or threat of loss of custody of children. So, if these circumstances were not present, they would continue to live in violence. The only reason that they took action was when there was an immediate threat to their survival. It's important to understand, that many times women go to the public health systems also when they have been injured with injuries. But because we have a culture of violence and silence surrounding the violence, many times when public health practitioners can recognize that these are not signs of falling off the stairs or running into a door or just a fall, still these are not taken into account because we believe that it's a personal thing which is happening and it's not reported. Some of this aspect has been changing now with awareness about violence growing. Now, we look at the different models which exist in terms of gender-based violence. This module is focusing on these theories and causes because there is a lot of, there are many things written about violence, but how do we really understand violence is what needs to be covered. So, amongst the sociological theories, one of the first views that is present is called the socio-cultural view. This explains female violence as a response to factors such as frustration, poverty, unemployment, unsatisfactory working conditions and poor parental modeling. The assumption here is that pressing demands made on families cause stress in men and they in turn oppress women by being violent. Now, Coing et al. Conducted a study in 2006 and found that economic pressure, lack of assets, low education, family violence history were all determinants of domestic violence in Uttar Pradesh. They also found that community norms that tolerated violence against women were strongly correlated with higher rates of abuse. So, they are looking at how, then we are finding a link between poverty and low socioeconomic status and violence, saying that when the status is lower and there is poverty, there is higher chance of violence. Now, this may not be completely supported by all theories, but this was what this particular theory is saying. Now, the next theory is the social learning theory of violence. This asserts that human aggression and violence are learnt. It explains that there are situations in which there is a tendency to respond aggressively in the background of prior experience and reinforcement received. People learn that violence serves a certain purpose and it can and should be used on others. So what social learning theory is saying is that when people grow up in households which are violent, or when they see other people being violent and they see that violence serves a purpose, they are likely to repeat that. So for example, even if a child is upset, maybe a boy sees his mother being beaten up by the father, he may get upset by that. But if he sees that the father is behaving in a certain manner and his point of view is agreed on always, or he is the head of the household because he is able to hit somebody and get his way, then the son may also learn this behavior to say that if I hit or if I beat people, then what I want will be achieved. So they are saying that it's through modeling that violence is learnt. The other theory which has been more popular has been the patriarchy theory. This was developed by Dubash and Dubash in 1979. They talked about the historical violence as being directed towards women. They said patriarchy is the cause for this systemic violence which is directed against wife, as it prescribes the subordinate roles to women. So if you look at the other theories where say how women's subordination is happening, now we can understand that the subordination is the fact which also leads to violence. They say that patriarchy can be defined as a social system in which men are placed above women. This establishes the cultural view that sons are preferable to daughters. The inequality faced by women and girls even results in their denial of rights of being born. So female feticide as an extreme manifestation of violence against women. So what this theory is actually saying is that it's because women are considered to be of an inferior status, they are considered, they are more prone to violence, and female feticide becomes the highest form of violence. The next theory is the conflict theory, which postulates that violent acts are generally thought to be the goal-directed and problem-solving in design, that violence is thought to bring out some needed change in society. Now, conflict is most likely to occur during the decision-making process, particularly if the process of decisions fails to follow the hierarchical power, which means hierarchical status in families assigned according to two factors, age and sex. With the rise in feminism, the dominance pattern is disrupted. Violence then becomes an effort to bring about a shift back towards the old order. Let me just explain this. So what this is trying to say is that conflict arises when decision making roles change. So usually within families, the power is depending on age. So the older people may have more power, and sex, that men will have more power than women. Now with the rise of the feminist movement, when women started demanding more rights and wanted to do more things themselves, be more involved in decision making, the dominance pattern becomes disrupted. And so violence is used to shift it back to the old order, to say that you cannot speak, you cannot have a part in the decision making, and therefore through violence we control you. The next theory is the resource theory. This theory assumes that all social systems revolve around threats or use of force. The more resources a person has, the less likely he or she is likely to use force. For families in which there are few financial resources, Gell said that there is a higher likelihood of violence. So again, this theory is somewhere saying that lower socioeconomic status and poverty may lead to higher likelihood of violence. But this theory has been criticized for not taking into account that women have less access to resources than men and hence should be more violent. So if you say that poverty or lower socioeconomic status should lead to violence because there are lesser resources, then women who have lower resources in other households also should be more violent. This explains violence by those having more resources than their victims, even though perpetrator may have a few resources to begin with. Now, a gendered resource theory would support the conclusion that the vast majority of these reasons for husbands beating their wives involve discrepancies between role expectations and actual behavior. So, the expectation is that wife should do A, B, C, D, and if she is not able to perform these roles, then she deserves to be beaten. And the resource theory also looks at certain other kinds of things. So, if you look at the state of Kerala, a woman's control of wealth or property, because there are certain societies which are matriarchal there, may not be threatening to gender norms. But if a woman earns a higher wage than husband, then that may be seen as abnormal, and therefore that could lead to violence within the household, which goes with the above statement that discrepancies between role expectations and actual behavior. So men are supposed to be earning more than their wives, but when wives are earning more than men, then there is a discrepancy in the role expectation, which may also lead to violence. Now, in terms of states where women are not working, when women start working, that could be an issue. But in a city like Bombay or Mumbai, however, a woman's employment is relatively more acceptable and thus less influential in domestic violence precipitation. There could be other reasons for domestic violence, but not so much as employment. Now we have the social exchange theory. This focuses on system of rewards and negative sanctions in human relations. It focuses on power, who has it and who doesn't. Abuser is the one with the power to exploit, while victim does not have the sufficient power to thwart the perpetrator's advances, to offer an alternative exchange. So, this is talking about power relations and saying some people have the power and some people don't. So, powerful people can exert violence. It explains why disclosure of abuse is difficult. This is because victims fear that disclosure will make their situations worse. So, if you see, different sociological theories are supporting different kinds of things and they are explaining different behaviors. Some of them have a similar, there is a basic which is similar to all of them, which is looking at a social system within the sociological theories. Now, why do victims not, when they are suffering violence for a very long time, why would they not talk about it? Now, the exchange theory says they can't talk about it because they fear that if nobody else helps them and they disclose outside, then their position may become worse. Then we have the family systems theory, which was developed by Strauss to explain the intra-family violence. This accounts for violence in home by viewing family as a purposive goal, which seeks adaptive social system. Violence is seen as a systems product. He specified the use of positive feedback in system creates an upward spiral of violence, and the negative feedback can maintain or reduce the level of violence. The theory was critiqued for overemphasizing social systems and ignoring individual personalities. But what it was basically saying is that when there is a positive feedback, that is when a person is violent and they are listened to and they are able to do their things, and nobody imposes any kind of punishment for them, and when even the victim themselves agree with the fact that we didn't do so and so and therefore we deserve the violence, there is whole positive feedback is created and violence tends to escalate. But if there was somebody who was stopping the violence or critiquing it, there would be a negative feedback in the system which would then reduce the violence. The next view is the feminist view. Now, the feminist view looked into the phenomenon of gender-based violence in the context of a male-female relationship. It holds that violence against women is perpetuated by patriarchy, which is supported by customs, force and law. They hold that all forms of family violence, which is child abuse, abuse on elderly, is inflicted on the powerless members of the family. Yet placing women-specific violence with other forms of violence could divert attention from women per se. They perceive violence against women as a separate category. So why they have emphasized that is because, if you look at violence against children, then children are seen as helpless and innocent and needed to be, who need to be protected more often. So if we look at all the violence together against all family members, then issues of women will take a secondary status, which is why they say that the violence against women is more and needs to be a specific category and needs to be looked at specifically, because they take on the more subordinate roles. Now, the major reasons that they have looked at is because customs sanction physical abuse of women. So, they may not sanction abuse of children and the elderly, but customs sanction abuse of women by stating that, you know, if they are not A, B, C, D is not done, they can be beaten up. Women are overwhelmingly the target of attack, and domestic work and childcare make women economically dependent on women, making them further more vulnerable to violent attacks. So, this aspect of women being responsible for childcare and child socialization and not having enough economic power makes them more vulnerable, and therefore it is important to understand women as a separate category when we are looking at violence within the family. Now, we come to the next set of theories, which are the social and social psychological theories. So, they look at both the social and psychological aspects. The first one is the frustration aggression theory, which was first stated in 1939 by Dollard. It explains the frustration is linked to aggression, and Margaret Elbow linked this theory to abuse phenomenon and gave the following premises: that human being and family are systems which attempt to maintain equilibrium of a state of homeostasis. They develop coping mechanisms to maintain this homeostasis. Any threat to the homeostasis may be external or internal or both. If usual coping mechanisms fail and tension is not relieved, it becomes progressively more difficult to maintain a sense of well-being and control. Individuals find it more difficult to control or discharge aggressive feelings, and the man is likely to experience ego rupture and become violent. Violence arises from a sense of helplessness or powerlessness. So, what she is saying is that there is a certain homeostasis in the system. If anything disrupts it, suppose there's loss of job, there's low financial resources coming into the household, there's some other kind of problem which is disrupting the schedule, then the levels of tension go up in the family, and then the man can resort to violence. The attachment theory states that it tries to explain the antecedents and consequences of physical abuse. So, Aschent and his colleagues have argued that physical abuse is strongly influenced by problems of attachment of abusers. It's talking about the fact that children who grow up in abusive families may be at risk of expressing abuse when they become adults. They say mechanisms used by children to manage anxiety will be continued into adulthood, and these people may be unable to form close attachments and express rejection through violence. So, because in childhood they have not been able to form positive attachments and have been exposed to violence, they grow up into adults who are not able to handle relationships and attachments well. And whenever there is a closeness in an attachment, they may reject it by being violent. Now, the psychological theories, the first one is the interpersonal view. This view holds that violence among spouses originates from abusers and victims' psychological abnormalities and their interactions with each other. So, Kaplan and Sadok have said that batterer husbands are immature, dependent, mentally neurotic, disturbed, suffering from strong feelings of inadequacy, and violence is believed to occur when such men are paired with hysterical, masochistic and immature women. Now, battered women are the ones who adhere to traditional sex roles and accept male superiority and esteem. Now, this view is actually talking about the characteristics of the victim and the batterer, and saying that it's their personalities which combine together to create violence. It traces the origin of violence in spousal mismatch, rationalizes the abuse and blames the victim. So, this is actually a theory which has been critiqued a lot, because it says violence is because of personalities and ends up blaming the victim rather than looking at other causes. One of the most prevalent theories of violence has been the cycle theory of violence, which was given by Leon Walker in 1979. She identifies some of the behavioral reinforcements that the battered woman receives that perpetuate her staying on in a relationship. So, she is looking at what sustains staying on in a violent relationship. She says it's rooted in a tension reduction hypothesis. The theory describes 3 phases of a battering relationship. There is a phase of tension building where a woman might try to avoid the abuse and make efforts to please the person. Then there is explosion phase where the battering incident occurs and it is the batterer who has control when it stops. The third phase is the contrition phase, in which the batterer becomes loving and apologetic. It is this phase that provides the affectional rewards women seek from marriage. Women hope that this phase will be maintained and other phases will not reoccur. Contrition phase eventually becomes shorter and may eventually change to a phase of no tension without overt expressions of love or contrition. So what she is saying is that there is tension, there is violence, and then there is apologies and gifts and are given by the man to the woman, which is why the woman stays on in a violent relationship. She is staying on for this particular phase of where she is getting, the apologies, the love, the affection, the gifts. So she believes that that will come back and the man is not truly bad. But eventually this cycle of violence, this phase of contrition, or the man being apologetic, becomes lesser and lesser when his behavior of violence is condoned again and again. So that is why it's called the cycle theory. So when we look at the ecological framework, it is looking at different aspects, how they combine to create violence. So the person, the micro factors, the ecological factors and the macro all combine to create violence. This conceptualizes violence as a multifaceted phenomenon which is affected by personal, situational, socio-cultural factors. The microsystem is the parents, the family, other intimate relationships. The exosystem consists of social structures, formal and informal. The world of work, neighborhood, social networks, identity groups. The macro represents the larger culture. In addition, it also reflects the importance of the mesosystem. It includes linkages between individuals, family and other ambits of involvement, such as places of work, extended family, network of peers, social institutions, police, courts and social service. In all countries and society, including India, the macro system level norms embedded in culture might exacerbate gender-based violence. So what happens is that they combine to create violence, and what is the interaction between the individual and the social systems. Some of the impact of violence against women includes impact on their physical health, which could lead to chronic headaches, hearing issues, vision, concentration problems, forced sex resulting in pelvic inflammatory disease, increased risk of sexually transmitted diseases including HIV, vaginal and anal tearing and other genitourinary health problems. Battered women also link forced sex and male partner control of contraceptive use with unintended pregnancy. So these are some of the physical health issues. Some of the mental health issues which can occur is depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, low self-esteem, a traumatic response framework, which is basically when trauma occurs when an individual is exposed to overwhelming events causing feelings of helplessness in the face of intolerable danger. Women facing violence can feel traumatized and helpless, which often prevents them from taking action against the abuser. Now, some of the things that we need to look at while working with survivors which have already been done include government and non-government organizations which offer preventive and supportive services. Services also exist which include Mahila Lok Adalats, counseling cells, shelter homes, family interventions. Organizations have sought to empower women through education, legal awareness, asset creation, mobilization of women's groups. One aspect has been of the special cell for women and children, which was a joint venture between Mumbai Police and Tata Institute to provide professional support and services to women and children facing violence. It works within the police station and offers socio-legal services and intervenes both at the micro and macro level. The success of this work has ensured that special cells have become a program of the Home Department and have been set up in several other states. This has interventions with men as well, because it was considered that only working with women is not going to reduce violence against women. Now, this module has covered aspects of violence in terms of situation and the various theories related to violence and how do we work with women. We have not looked at what are the laws related to violence against women, because this is beyond the purview of this module. There are links provided for this and please go through them for further information. Thank you for paying attention to the module.